Boldwood presents Death at the Old Curiosity Shop, written by Debbie Young and read by Willow Nash. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Fast Forward. What could be more idyllic than moving out of the bustling city centre of Broadwick to the peaceful Cotswold village of Little Pride? Every building there is a luscious concoction of honey-coloured stone. Gorgeous cottage gardens overflow with lilac and lavender, apple blossom and foxgloves. So that fateful spring day, when I had the opportunity to buy a tumble-down old home at a bargain price, I embraced it as exactly the fresh start I needed. Little did I realise that in Little Pride, nothing is ever quite as it seems. Although I knew exactly the right question to ask young Miles Swansong, the estate agent, and he gave me the answers I wanted to hear, I was particularly pleased when he confirmed the village was in an area of outstanding natural beauty. This means the local council's planning department has particularly strict rules to ensure it remains unspoiled. Whenever you want to repair or extend your house, or to build new homes, you must seek the council's permission at your own expense, with no guarantee that it will be granted. It's therefore important to keep on good terms with the council's planning department, especially when you're planning a major overhaul on an old property, as I was, turning a former shop into a cosy cottage home. So, finding the body of one of its officers sprawled across the tea table on my front terrace was unfortunate, to say the least. Wrapped around her throat was a tie-dyed scarf that I didn't remember her wearing earlier. In her hand was a bunch of cow parsley, and in the other an old-fashioned hexagonal blue bottle with the word poison embossed down one side. The only dead bodies I'd ever seen before had been much more tidily presented. The fine collection of Egyptian mummies, donated by Edwardian tomb raiders to the City Museum where I used to work. The mummies were bandaged as neatly as if it were done by Girl Guides training for their first aid badge. No one had gift-wrapped this body, which, to my surprise, turned out to be just as well. Let me take you back to how it all started. Chapter 2. The Lie of the Land. The fact that the estate agent trying to sell me the cottage looked about 12 years old should have rung alarm bells. But having just hit 50, I was used to working with younger people, so I didn't think to question his ability. It had been a quarter of a century since I'd bought what I thought would be our forever home with my then-partner, Stephen. At the time, we'd felt rather smug. Having met in Freshers' Week at university at a History Society party, our common interest in the past had quickly forged a firm bond between us. I was hugely into the Victorians, the era I eventually specialised in for my history degree, and Stephen, a law student, had a hobbyist's interest in historical arts and crafts. Our shared passion for visiting museums and stately homes, when our peers were more interested in pubs and clubs, made us feel terribly grown up. It also convinced me that I'd found my soulmate. When our friends teased us for being prematurely middle-aged, I'd laughed it off, dismissing them as jealous and immature. I thought I'd had the very last laugh, becoming a homeowner, albeit with a huge mortgage and a deposit saved by depriving ourselves of a social life and holidays as soon as we started earning, while they were still flat-sharing and sofa-surfing, student-style. My parents, seeing me follow in their footsteps as a middle-class urban householder, although on the other side of the country from their home in Tunbridge Wells, were terribly pleased and proud. Having got onto the property ladder at the age of 25, we planned to pay off our mortgage and own our own home outright before we hit our half-century. From that point forward, we planned to spend our disposable income on fun stuff, such as travel and entertainment. I'd never have guessed that within mere months of making the last payment on our mortgage, I'd be house hunting once more, and that this time I'd be on my own. When I booked the viewing, I'd made it clear that my partner was a lawyer. I thought that ought to mark me out as someone who knew what they were doing when buying a house, a client not to be messed with. Well, ex-partner, actually. But Swansong and Sons didn't need to know that. Nor did they need to know that Stephen's expertise wasn't in conveyancing, but in trademark law. It would be easy for me to blame the estate agent for much of what went wrong. Not for the criminal assault on the planning officer, of course, but for his spectacular ineptitude. I must have been his dream client, an eager cash buyer in a hurry, with no chain, albeit with only half the value of the house we had just sold. He told me what I'd wanted to hear, and I didn't realise the many errors he had made until long after I'd moved in. I should have been more careful and vigilant, especially when I could see he was so young and inexperienced. My first mistake was to trust Miles when he said he could fast-track me into the home of my dreams, if only I'd be a little flexible about my requirements. He was a smooth talker, persuading me to consider moving further afield than I'd originally planned. After living in the city for so long, the idea of more space for my money and fresh country air appealed to me. When Stephen and I parted, I'd assumed I'd have to downsize from my urban Edwardian terraced house. So when Miles told me that if I moved a mere 20 miles from the city centre, I could buy a whole house, I couldn't resist. That's how, in the middle of May, I came to be standing on the high street of a quiet village in the Cotswolds, clutching the particulars of a quaint Victorian cottage. Nell Little's Cotswold Curiosity Shop, announced the peeling hand-painted wooden board above the bay window at the front of the house. "Cute name," I commented to Miles, although I suspected the Dickensian reference would be lost on him. If I were to buy it, I'd rename it Curiosity Cottage to preserve its heritage as a former shop. That should stand me in good stead with my new neighbours. It would look good on a change of address card too. When Miles stared at me blankly, I realised that his generation might not know what change of address cards were. They'd just post on WhatsApp or Snapchat or whatever the latest fad was for keeping tabs on your mates. Miles might have been half my age, but he was making me feel twice mine. "I'd better not buy a cat, though," I quipped, trying to joke my way out of my embarrassment. "Why, are you allergic to cats?" he asked, in tones of practised politeness. I expect Mr. Swansong Sr. had coached young Miles in making polite conversation with strangers as part of his training. "I'm allergic to mushrooms," he continued conversationally. "They bring me out in a rash." He was probably doing his best to find common ground with me, so I tried to banter with him, to use a Gen Z term. "Don't worry, I wouldn't plan to eat the cat." He gasped and took a step backwards, clutching his electronic tablet to his chest. You'd have thought I'd just told him I was a cannibal. No, that's a joke," I added hastily. "You know the old saying, curiosity killed the cat?" From his reply, it was clear that he didn't, but at least he tried to enter into the spirit of things. "I suppose it would if the cat was curious enough to climb into a washing machine and you closed the door and turned it on and didn't notice." "No!" I glanced around, hoping my shriek of horror at his suggestion hadn't frightened my potential new neighbours. I'd heard Cotswold villages can be reluctant to welcome outsiders. I didn't want to alienate them before I'd even moved in. If I moved in, what was I thinking? "Please, forget about the cats," I begged. "Just tell me everything you know about this property." I stepped back to the curb to better appraise the front of the house. Considering the cottage had been standing empty for some months, it didn't look too bad. "Firstly, is it listed?" Miles stood up a little straighter, pressed a button on his tablet and waited for a file to load. "No, it's not listed in any way, apart from on our company website. Ha ha." I suspect he'd been fed that quip as part of his training. His tablet gave a cheery ping, and he read from the screen. Its price has recently been lowered to a more realistic level to facilitate a faster sale. I know you don't want to hang around, given you've already sold your current property and there are no other parties involved in associated transactions, so its immediate availability would suit your particular need. You mean there's no chain to delay the sale, and I can have vacant possession? If he'd cut to the chase instead of waffling, he'd have speeded up the sale process. I crossed the Cotswold stone slabs that formed the hard standing in front of the cottage and peered through the grimy window into the cluttered front room, once home to Nell Little's shop. It doesn't look very vacant to me, I observed. I pulled a tissue from my pocket and, keeping my back to Miles so he couldn't see what I was doing, I spat on it and scrubbed a clean spy hole. Well, relatively clean, if you don't count my spit. An old-fashioned wooden counter ran around two sides of the little room, with floor-to-ceiling shelves behind. Every flat space was filled with a mishmash of objects of all shapes and sizes, from a china trinket dish overflowing with enamel badges to a dressmaker's dummy beside the vast brass till, like the headless, limbless ghost of its former proprietor. It reminded me of something in a museum, the kind that recreates historic high streets from bygone eras. Attractive in its way, but not somewhere you choose to live. It looks to me as if the shop's stock is all still inside, I continued. Shouldn't Nell Little's executors have disposed of it all by now? I stood aside and beckoned Miles to peer through my makeshift porthole. Ah, yes, you're right. I remember now. Sadly, the departure of the old lady who used to run this delightful cottagecore outlet was what you might call unplanned. Poor soul never had the chance to dispose of the property in an organised manner. She probably hadn't heard of Swedish death cleaning. I flinched. I hadn't either, but it sounded a bit drastic for my liking. So, Nell Little had died. I just hoped she didn't meet her end in the house. I had no desire to take on a ghost as a sitting tenant. But the good news is that everything inside is included in the asking price, Miles added, his voice bright and cheery. That means you can either keep her stuff or sell it on at a profit. He probably hadn't lived long enough to accumulate as much clutter as Nell Little had, nor indeed as much as Stephen, a compulsive collector. My girlfriend sells a load of her old stuff on Vinted. Most likely Barbie dolls and Sylvanian families if she was the same age as him. It's a website for selling your unwanted, pre-loved clothes and bags and jewellery and shoes, he added. I bridled. He was a bit young for mansplaining. I glanced at my watch, impatient to see inside now. Beyond the disused shop area, I might find some pleasant surprises. This looked like the kind of place that might have kept its original features. The light-filled shop area would make a very pleasant sitting room, using the wall-mounted shelves as bookcases. I could move the wooden counter into the kitchen to use as an island. Wasn't every kitchen meant to have an island these days? I wasn't the dinosaur Miles took me for. Vinted might provide a nice extra source of income besides your pension, Miles was saying. I gritted my teeth so hard that when I replied, I felt like a ventriloquist. Perhaps I could throw my voice to the dressmaker's dummy. I'm not retiring. I've at least another 16 years to work before I can draw my state pension. Until then, I've got a good, steady job at the City Museum. Unperturbed, he gave me a radiant smile. Then it might be a lucrative hobby. My girlfriend says Preloved is the new. Preloved? A bit like me, I thought, but didn't say. Once loved, and now discarded. Not that I'd fetch much of a price on Vinted, the way I was feeling. He fumbled with a huge collection of keys attached on a chain to his belt loop. The weight of them made his trousers sag a little on one side, allowing his shirt tail to make a bid for freedom. This added to my impression that his suit had been bought to grow into, his first school uniform on going up to big school. So, are you ready to look inside now? He was saying. As ready as I'll ever be, I replied, and I followed him through the shop door. His guided tour of the tumble-down cottage didn't take long. In the days before it had been converted into a shop, the room at the front would likely have been a neat and tidy parlour, reserved for Sundays and visitors. Behind lay a smaller room, once a kitchen, but now a dining room with a couple of low easy chairs in the corners. A single-storey mid-century extension behind it housed a galley kitchen, smaller than the one I was used to, but ample for my needs. The vintage electric cooker would need a safety check, and the low white stone sink could have done with some bleach, but if it was cottage core I was after, this would be a good starting point. Double doors open from the rear wall of the kitchen extension onto a long back garden the width of the house. Kicking the base of the damp door frame to force it open, Miles led us out onto a semicircle of Cotswold stone that the estate agent's particulars had described as a rustic terrace. Beyond lay a small, scraggy lawn, bordered by blossoming apple and lilac trees and flowering shrubs. What looked like an overgrown allotment beyond had presumably once been Nell Little's kitchen garden. "Look, it's been rewilded," exclaimed Miles, kicking aside a mesh of ivy creeping across the stepping stones, its stems swollen to the girth of a young tree trunk. "Very good for the environment, and low maintenance too. Ideal for anyone troubled by arthritis or similar." He looked me up and down, as if checking for the frailties of old age. "I expect your cat will enjoy exploring here," he added. "Just call me Schrödinger," I murmured, turning my back on him and crossing the garden to the fence that ran the length of the right boundary. In the adjacent field, a couple of grazing donkeys came lolloping over to befriend me. "You'd never get this much garden for the price in the city centre," Miles called after me. At least that was one thing we could agree on. After a few minutes of stroking the donkeys' soft muzzles, I went to explore the rest of the plot. I trod carefully through the undergrowth in the old vegetable patch, looking out for fox droppings, or worse. To my delight, beyond the dilapidated dry stone wall at the bottom of the garden lay nothing but fields, where thick green wheat was rippling in the warm breeze. That meant no human neighbours on two sides of the property. Such privacy would be a boon after living in the centre of town. On the third side lay a larger old stone house with a massive dry stone wall about 8 feet high. My garden felt so secluded that it would feel like my own country estate. Picturing myself spending summer evenings and weekends turning this quaint, unspoiled plot— unspoiled, I was starting to think like an estate agent myself now— into my own rural idyll, I wandered back up the path towards Miles. He was ignoring the donkeys, who were lingering near to my fence, their heads close together as if in conversation as they swung their tails. Instead, Miles was swatting up on his tablet. As I approached, the donkeys turned their soulful brown eyes on me, and my heart melted. I plucked a handful of succulent dandelion leaves from my so-called lawn and dangled them over the fence. "Here you go, my lovelies," I crooned, waggling the leaves to encourage them. They didn't need to be asked twice, nibbling the proffered greenery without touching my fingers. Miles picked up on my enthusiasm. "Aren't they gorgeous?" he cooed. "What could be more relaxing than coming home from work each evening to find these beauties waiting to greet you?" It was an enticing image. To be honest, I knew I was being played, and I should have asked more questions, but he was telling me what I wanted to hear. Mostly. "Provided your cat doesn't mind," he added. "Now, let's go and see the upstairs." The layout upstairs was predictable, the same as downstairs, minus the kitchen extension. The main bedroom was at the front, above the shop, and the second bedroom was over the dining room. A small section had been hived off from the smaller bedroom to form a compact bathroom, as an afterthought. The cottage must have been built in the days of outdoor privies and tin baths in front of the fire. Without the detritus of the shop's stock, the front bedroom felt much larger than the shop, even though it was fully furnished. I could picture the back bedroom, with its pleasant view of the garden, doubling as a dressing room, something I'd always fancied. But first, I'd have to jettison Nell Little's furniture. I already had a house full of my own. Alternatively, as that had been bought jointly with Stephen, and would always in my mind be associated with him, I could sell all that and have a completely fresh start. Beneath the dust and cobwebs, Nell Little's furniture was solid wood and would polish up a treat. Or I could give it an artsy makeover with trendy chalk paint. I found it harder to warm to the bathroom, a clinical black and white tiled affair with a dusty bath teeming with woodlice. "A timeless monochrome," enthused Miles. "Easy to liven with a pop of colour here and there." Honestly, I thought, you should go on Mastermind, special subject, the euphemism. He pointed at the checkered floor. "Do you like chess? You could make it a chess-themed bathroom." I shook my head. I wasn't going to tell him that Stephen collected chess sets, amongst other things. That would only encourage him. Besides, I wasn't going to take style tips from someone whose suit didn't fit him properly. As Miles began to descend the stairs, I ran a fingertip over the blistered varnish on the banisters, sending conker-coloured flakes fluttering onto the threadbare stair carpet. "So, now you've seen all this delightful property, do you have any questions?" he asked when I caught up with him in the shop. What had I forgotten? "Oh, parking. Is there rear access to the garden? I'd like to be able to park my car off-road." "Vehicular access?" He left a gap between every syllable that made me think he'd been practicing that phrase. "Not that I know of, but that doesn't mean there isn't any." I admired his optimism. "But you could always park on the hard standing in front of the house. It's amply proportioned for a family car." Gazing out of the shop window with narrowed eyes, I decided my Fiat Panda would fit there with room to spare. Suddenly, Taylor Swift began to sing, her voice, Miles' ringtone, muffled by his copious suit. He pulled his mobile out of his pocket and trotted back to the kitchen to take the call out of my earshot. Apparently, it didn't occur to him that the house was so small I could still hear every word. "Yeah, she's definitely making buying signals," I heard him say. To my surprise, I realised he was right. As I waited for him to finish his call and return, I was already beginning in my head to design my change of address card for Curiosity Cottage. It was the first aspect of my forced relocation that I'd have total control over. That was a pleasingly empowering thought. Chapter 3. Divide and Conquer. It was exactly the sort of cottage Stephen would have hated. As soon as I got home, I clicked send on my email confirming my offer of $5,000 below the asking price, trusting to fate. If Swansong and Sons accepted my bid, the cottage was meant to be mine. If they haggled or told me other buyers were outbidding me, I'd let it go. Just because I was a cash buyer didn't mean I was prepared to get enmeshed in the gazumping shenanigans that had crept back into the property market lately. Whatever else Stephen had taken from me, I still had my principles and my pride. I also had my independence, a gift Stephen inadvertently bestowed upon me when he announced he was leaving to find himself in India. With hindsight, it was a damning indictment of how far apart we'd drifted. I hadn't even realised he was lost. After spending over half my life as part of a couple, I was now free to please myself at last. This included having the freedom to live wherever I liked that was within my budget. I could afford either an on-trend city centre apartment, a small new-build house on one of the many estates springing up in edge-of-town brownfield sites, or, as Miles Swansong had now persuaded me, a rambling cottage in the country. Stephen, I knew, would have gone for the smart city centre apartment if he'd been staying in the UK. The very thought of rural living was enough to trigger his hay fever.
I couldn't stand the farming smells or getting stuck behind a tractor on the way to work,
he objected when, around the 10th anniversary of our first date, we'd never married, I mooted we moved to the country. This was the man who thought nothing of inhaling exhaust fumes as he weaved his motorbike through city traffic jams, morning and evening.
They're notoriously stuck up in those little villages,
he objected a few years later when he found me glued to an episode of Escape to the Country, my secret television vice.
It takes generations to be accepted in a place like that. You'd always be an incomer.
As he couldn't name any neighbours in our city centre street, that was hardly relevant, but his objections made me feel as if my dream of rural community life was completely beyond my reach. However, as the years went by, we talked less and less about future plans, conversing only about the here and now, such as which film to watch on Netflix or which takeaway to order. Our regular date nights, which I instigated to try to rebuild our old closeness, were in cinemas or theatres, places in which it was impossible to talk to each other without being shushed by those around us. We might as well have fixed a date in his and hers isolation tanks. We lived in the moment, which for a while I thought was a good idea. Every newspaper or magazine I opened seemed to have an article on mindfulness, positing that focusing on the present was beneficial for mental health. Then I realised we were only living that way because neither of us was looking forward to a future together. Even so, when I was about to hit 50, I suggested that for practical reasons we should marry, or at least embark on a civil partnership. That way, whoever died first, the other would be able to remain in our house. As Stephen was a lawyer, I thought he'd be keen on this idea, but when he declined, I decided he was just not ready yet to countenance his own mortality. Besides, my mum had drummed into me from when I was a teenager that boys mature later than girls. I gave Stephen the benefit of the doubt. After all, he was 8 months younger than me. It wouldn't be that long to wait for him to catch up. Don't we always believe what we want to believe? Then, on the auspicious date of the 1st of April, a month after we'd celebrated paying the final instalment on our mortgage, I arrived back from work early one day to find him in flagrante delicto. No, not in bed with another woman, but in deep conversation with an estate agent, soliciting an evaluation on our beautiful Edwardian villa. As I opened the front door, a woman in a tailored blazer and column dress was saying in clear, ringing tones, "So your half, after the costs of the sale, should amount to just short of 400 grand. As soon as I flung the door open, they jumped apart, and Stephen took an extra step backwards, a guilty grimace on his face. Even his quick wit as a lawyer couldn't help him come up with an innocent explanation for what I'd just heard. Realising that she'd made a faux pas, the woman dropped her smartphone, which landed face up on the hall carpet, revealing the sum she'd just done on her calculator app. Despite my outrage, I couldn't help feeling sorry for her being such a dimwit as to need electronic help to divide 800 grand by 2. But I focused the rest of my emotions, horror, wrath, indignation, on Stephen. By some miracle of self-control, I kept my voice low and calm. "So, when were you going to tell me that you're planning to sell the house and leave me?" That was the only reason she could be splitting the property's value in half. Stephen folded his arms across his chest.
"Don't make this all my fault,"
he began, but the flustered estate agent interrupted. "I think I'd better be going." "Oh no, please, don't end your secret liaison on my account," I retorted. "I've better things to do, like go and find a more competent estate agent to find a new forever home for myself." I turned to Stephen. "And wherever you're going, you can take all your crap with you. My new place is going to be clean, tidy, minimalist and modern.
Not chock-a-block with your mad collections, you train spotter, you. I apologised to train spotters everywhere for that outburst, but I wasn't thinking rationally. Stephen cleared his throat. Actually, that's sort of the point. I was going to put it all into storage and leave it behind until I have time to sell it. Or you can sell it for me, if you like, on commission. I want a fresh start, and I'll be taking only the essentials with me. On the road, I'll be living a minimalist life, unfettered by material possessions. He waved a hand at the clutter that filled every room in the house. In the entrance hall alone was his collection of curious walking sticks, 5 pairs of biker boots. Who needs 5 pairs of biker boots when they have only 2 feet and 1 motorbike? And a shaker peg rail incongruously displaying baseball caps that looked ludicrous on a man no longer fit enough to play baseball. What minimalist hires a self-storage facility? I snapped. He ignored my jibe, perhaps because he knew he was being hypocritical. I plan to liquidate the rest of my assets to fund my travels for the rest of my life. I'll liquidate your... I'm sorry, I really think I should be going now, said the estate agent, picking up her phone and striding to the front door in one smooth movement. Shall I send through the draft particulars in the morning, Mr. Harris? Stephen and I held each other's gaze for what seemed like an eternity, tears filling our eyes. Yes, please, we both said at once. And that was the last thing we'd ever agreed on. Despite the ignominious end of our relationship, I was determined not to allow myself to be fazed by any of Stephen's requests. He'd made his decision, and I just wanted to move on and start over. Stephen was also in a hurry to be off. That same day, he began packing up all his belongings that wouldn't fit into his motorbike panniers, ready to remove them to a self-storage warehouse on the city outskirts, where he'd already booked a space. I didn't ask how much his monthly storage costs would be, but I was sure they were eye-watering. All I really need is to get the cash from my half of the house sale, and then I can be on my way, he insisted. And all I want is the half of my life that you took from me, I thought. But I didn't say it aloud, wanting to be the bigger person. Being combative wouldn't solve anything. What about working out your notice? I asked, the morning after the estate agent's visit. The last time he'd changed jobs, his contract had included a 6-month notice period. At the time, he'd considered it a badge of honour, denoting his new employer thought him indispensable. He closed his eyes, his face contorting with embarrassment. I guessed the truth before he could bring himself to tell me. Oh no, you've been sacked, haven't you? Is that what this is all about? You're worried you won't be able to get another job, so you've decided to do a runner instead. My eyes widened in horror. Don't tell me you've done something illegal and must now flee the country to escape justice. I couldn't think what that might be. His work at a trademark lawyer was hardly high risk. When at last he spoke, his voice was barely audible. They paid me off in lieu of notice 6 months ago. I'm not being as impulsive as you think. I've had 6 months to think through my position and plan what to do with the rest of my life. This is definitely what I need and want to do. I'm sorry, Alice. Despite the harsh words that had passed between us, he put his arms around my neck and drew me close. I leaned into him, and we both wept, mourning the end of our non-marriage. When I told my mum on the phone that night, it was the first time in weeks that I'd called her, she just tutted. Bit old to take a gap year, isn't he? Perhaps that was the problem. We hadn't allowed ourselves any freedom after graduation, just bowing to parental hopes to climb aboard the train of middle-class materialism. Only now had Stephen engaged the ejector seat. But where did that leave me? At work the next day, during my morning coffee break in the museum cafe, I made myself count my blessings. Once the house was sold, I'd have enough to buy at least a flat to live in mortgage-free. I had a job I enjoyed, and although my salary was much less than Stephen's, it was enough for my modest needs. Now I'd also have complete control over my own space, which had been gradually eroded by Stephen's clutter. Working in a museum had probably made me more sympathetic to his collections than most people, until they got out of hand. If I'd resisted earlier, would we have stayed together? Probably not. I couldn't blame his material goods for the breakdown in our relationship. It didn't mean I had to like them, though. Positive thinking about my new, streamlined home enabled me to put on a brave face about Stephen's departure. Emptied of his stuff, our house seemed twice its previous size, which no doubt helped speed up its sale. Our highly desirable residence, as the estate agent's blurb put it, with great access to local schools, shops and public transport links, was quickly snapped up by a professional couple with literally the classic 2.4 children. The wife was 3.5 months pregnant, she proudly told us on their first viewing. This made the sale especially poignant, because Stephen and I had never been lucky enough to have children. Or rather, we left it too late to try. Every time I asked him about it, he'd say, "Ask me again when I'm 40. And when that time came, it was too late. After a couple of years of trying, my body decided to go into early menopause. Looking back, I can't believe I went along with him to keep the peace. Although I bottled up my anger and disappointment, that was probably another reason why we eventually drifted apart. On the day of Stephen's departure, just before the sale was completed, I made him his favourite sandwiches, ham and coleslaw on granary, before waving him off on what must have felt to him like the first step towards the rest of his life. Mine too, I suppose. When he turned the corner at the end of our road, disappearing from my view, I felt like half a person. Then, after staring for a moment at the sold sign beside the front gate, I went back inside the house to start packing my own possessions, silently reciting that list of blessings, like a Catholic telling a rosary. If I'd known how many of those supposed blessings were about to be swept away, I'd probably have slumped on the stairs and wept. Instead, as I made up the first cardboard packing case, transforming it from flat pack to cube, my whole body began to tingle with a heady blend of liberation, excitement, and trepidation. No more compromise, no more clutter. My future was all mine. Like the Doctor in Doctor Who, I would regenerate, and I couldn't wait to see how the new me would turn out. Chapter 4. The Disappearing Donkeys. Danny Kimani, my best friend at work, set down 2 mugs of instant coffee on the table in the staff lunchroom.
"They're the least chipped mugs I could find," he said. "Honestly, you'd think the museum could run to some new ones now and again, even if they're only remaindered stock from the gift shop."
I wrapped my hands around the mug and blew away the steam before taking a sip. Danny and I had just given a talk in the Victorian schoolroom to a noisy group of Year 5 visitors, and we needed to revive our voices before we took our turn on the welcome desk. Actually, I'd borne the brunt of the session, as I was the museum's Victorian specialist. Danny's expertise is in classical civilization, the subject of his degree. We learned a lot by doubling up on school talks, listening to each other bang on. Now that my offer on the Cotswold Curiosity Shop had been accepted, I was bursting to tell him all about it. Previously, I hadn't allowed myself to get too excited in case it all fell through. "My new house has got donkeys, Danny."
"What, living in it? You're taking on 4-legged lodgers?"
"No, silly. I don't mean they come with my new cottage. They live next door. Well, in the field next to my new cottage, anyway. There isn't a house there.